Mom, you have to accept the fact that you grew up in a cult. 39 children, 60 adults. Everybody was spying on everybody else. When you would see people talking, you would wonder, was it about you? In order to go to heaven, when you died, you needed to be Catholic. Husbands and wives had already been forced to take a vow of celibacy. They were now completely separated. Father Feeney and Catherine Clarke, Sister Catherine, as she came to be called, the power behind the throne until she sat on the throne and eviscerated Father Feeney. Her objective was to create a community of people who were dedicated solely to God, which meant that you could have no personal preferences for anyone, including your parents, including your siblings, to direct the entire momentum of her life to make sure that nobody ever had sex. Pretty soon, all of us started living in a group of houses, 7 houses. And then one day when I was 6 years old, all the children that were 3 years of age and older would no longer live with their parents, but would live communally. The men put a big red stockade fence around the property where we were living. And all of a sudden, the outside world was gone.
Hey, my name is Shalise Ansola, and this is Close to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening and you would like to see our faces, head on over to our YouTube channel at Close to Consciousness. We love it when you interact with a post. It boosts the algorithm. It shows the guests that you care, and we just love seeing all those words of encouragement that you leave for our guests. It means so much to us. So today's guest, she reached out because she's just publishing a new book, but I went to her website and found her first book, which is exactly what we talk about on this channel. She is from a very insulated Catholic cult that was in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm going to look at the name because I don't want to get it wrong. Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. We're going to be talking about all the ways in which she grew up in the cult, how she was separated from her family in some ways, the punishment strategies that they use to keep them away from the outside world. There's so much to get into. So thank you so much for joining us, Patricia.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. So you were telling me a story off camera and I paused you because I'm like, wait till we record. So I would love it if you could share how you didn't even understand or fully recognize that the group that you grew up in was actually a cult until your daughter confronted you.
Yes. I didn't start writing the book until I was 60 years old. And I had kept the whole story as a complete secret. Nobody outside of 2 people, one of whom was my husband, had I ever told the story to. And I was 45 years old when my children were born. I had twins. And 20 years later, my daughter was reading my manuscript. She was away at college. And she came home for a weekend. And she walked into the house and she said, "Mom, I have 2 things to tell you." And I thought, whoa, all right, I better hear this. She said, "First, you have to stop everything until you finish this book." That was fascinating to me because it told me that my daughter wasn't ashamed of me. My daughter wasn't afraid to tell her friends or to share with her friends my story.
Yeah.
I was the one in writing the book who was fearful of the outcome. And that's why I had never told anyone. And then the second thing she said to me was, "And Mom, you have to accept the fact that you grew up in a cult." And I was stunned. Was practically finished with my book. And not once, and not even in the published book, do I use the word cult once. Because for me, this was my home. I didn't think of it as a cult. I thought of it as a strange and troubling place to grow up. But the word cult was kind of anathema to me within the context of my own home.
It's hard, especially when that's all you know, to really step outside of that perspective and see it in a new light. So usually it does take other people to say, hey, why don't you check out this stuff on high control groups? Or interesting. Do you think that's a cult? It's kind of similar to your group. For you to really process it in a new way because you were in it until you were 18, right?
Yes, just a couple of months shy of 18. And I had, for all intents and purposes, been born into it. And you're right, I did start thinking about and then reading about and then analyzing cult behavior. But to me, when my daughter was 20 and I was 65, I should have been fully mature by then. But for me, a cult meant Jim Jones
Hmm.
or the Manson group, things like that. Even the Symbionese army that was in the 60s and 70s, it just didn't strike me that that was like what my life was. But in terms of manipulation, it's exactly what was happening.
Yeah. So I wish I could have finished the entire book, but as I was reading, it's great. I don't even think we've mentioned the name, Little Sister. Everyone go check it out. We'll put the link in the description. As I was reading through the first chapters, absolutely the measures of control, manipulation, the leader at the top. So let's talk more about the group specifically so we can get an idea, our audience can get an idea of the group that you were a part of. So if you could explain the father, the guy who was leading the charge, how he came to lead, and how he was essentially excommunicated from the Catholic Church.
You know, the origin of the organization was actually very positive. It was founded in 1940 by a married woman who worked at a bookstore in Harvard Square, and she was very Catholic, and she founded it with two young men from Harvard College who had become Catholics. And the idea was to set up a club for Catholic students at Harvard and Radcliffe and other Boston colleges, but primarily those two. And it was be very, very successful. So in 1943, 3 years after she founded it, this woman, Catherine Clarke, reached out to the Archdiocese of Boston, as well as the Jesuits, because this fellow was a Jesuit, and said that she really wanted a chaplain at the organization. And the chaplain that she had in mind was a man named Father Leonard Feeney. And he was an author, a humorist, a theologian. He was educated at Oxford. He traveled the world. He had a wonderful sense of humor. And he was really, in a certain way, a romantic. And he came aboard. He got the permission of both the Archdiocese and the Jesuit provincial. And he came on board. And from there, the organization blossomed even more. And after World War II ended, so in 1945, there were hundreds of GIs coming back and going to colleges in the area. Harvard, Radcliffe, Boston College, Boston University. And this place that was called St. Benedict Center was kind of a haven for Catholics who had returned from the war and were now in college and were looking for a place to where they could talk theology, talk their religion. It was in that post-war period that things began to change. And Father Feeney, as everyone knew him, while still, finding romances, putting together people and marrying them, sending other people off to become priests, sending other women off to the convent, trying to basically help young people in their life's vocation. He suddenly also became very adamant about one dogma of the Catholic faith, which every religion has its dogmas, its rules, its beliefs. And that particular one was, in order to go to heaven when you died, you needed to be Catholic. I think we know plenty of religions that have the belief that their religion is the one true religion.
Yep.
But the Catholic Church at that time was trying to become a little more ecumenical. And the Archbishop at the time said to Father Feeney, please, don't go down that route. We're trying to make friends with the Jews. We're trying to make friends with our Protestant colleagues. And Father Feeney wouldn't. And he was adamant about that. And so my parents, who met at the center, my mother was an 18-year-old who had simply converted to Catholicism the prior year. She was brought to the center, as it was called, by the priest that had been indoctrinating her. And the day she was there, my father, who was in graduate school at Boston College and studying philosophy and had been introduced to the center as a veteran who was, in school, and he was 29 at the time, the two of them met. And Father Feeney, 6 months later, married them. And 11 months later, I was born. But while my father was teaching at Boston College, which is a Jesuit college, he and two other men from the organization, both of whom were married and had children, they were being pressured not to support Father Feeney's interpretation of the dogma of the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
And all three of them refused to obey the head of the college, of Boston College. And shortly after I was born, when I was like 5 months old, 6 months old, they were fired from Boston College. And it was then that the organization came together and founded that religious community, which was called the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And there were 52 or 3 adults, and there were a few children. There were 12 married couples, and over the next few years, 5 or 6 children went to a total of 39 children, all living together, all sharing everything communally. And my parents, who had bought their house on the GI Bill after World War II, sold their house and gave the proceeds to the center.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of this communal relationship, which for me, a little child, was fantastic because I had all these quotes, uncles and aunts, highly educated people. I didn't really understand the dark side of what was going on until I was about 4 years old. And then I really did see it actually changing in front of my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact of the matter is, they would take me down by the Charles River. We could pick daisies together. We would read stories together, or they would read to me. I was before I could read. And there was always someone to answer my questions. And I felt so wonderfully stimulated. But pretty soon, all of us started living in a group of houses, 7 houses, where all the couples and all their children lived. And when I was about 4 years old, the men put a big red stockade fence around the property where we were living. And all of a sudden, the outside world was gone. No more trips down to the river. No more walking up the street and skipping and holding hands with an adult. And that was an enormous change, but I still had my family. We had the top floor of a 3-family house. And by the time I was 6 years old, I was the oldest of 5 children that my parents had. I thought life was wonderful. I knew that there was a threat. I knew that Father Feeney was not supposed to be saying Mass, but it seemed safe. It seemed wonderfully safe. And then one day when I was 6 years old, the decision was made. I was simply informed that all the children that were 3 years of age and older would no longer live with their parents, but would live communally.
Mm.
And the apartment that had been my family's, that 3rd floor apartment, my parents moved out of it that day. And that evening, when I went back in, it was set up as 4 bedrooms with 2 beds for each of the 8 girls that would be living on that floor. My sister Kathy, who was only 4 at the time, was there. And the experience was really very jarring for me because suddenly I felt, at the age of 6, I now suddenly needed to watch out for my sister Kathy.
That must have been so traumatic for you as a young child because in the early chapters of your book, you really talk about this loving relationship you have with your parents, especially your dad, and he would kiss you goodnight and say, "Goodnight, princess." And it was this thing that you had come to expect, this regimen that you felt comfortable with. And then all of a sudden it's taken away from you and you're left by yourself, even though there's other kids, you feel this sort of isolation away from your family.
Yes. I mean, the good news was that we saw them every night. We
Mm.
saw them at Mass. We saw them in the refectory where we all ate. But now the children ate entirely separately from their parents. So recreation in the evening was the only real time I could spend with my parents. And I loved it. I made the most of it. But I also knew that the life I was leading suddenly was so, so different from the one I had shared with them. You know, the rules that were instilled the moment we were separated from our parents. There was one woman who was assigned over all the children, and the rules she made were emotionally shocking. And I remember one in particular, because when we were separated, my baby sister was less than 6 months old. And so recreation time at night was the only time I could talk to her. And when she started to walk, 6 months after that, I would hold her. She would hold my finger with her tiny little hand, and I would help her walk in the little playground that was there. Shortly thereafter, we were called into a meeting, and the woman that ran all the children said, "You are no longer allowed to hold the hands of your little brothers and sisters."
Mm.
I felt as though it was directed at me, just because I only saw it in that light, but I could not make any sense of it. And of course, I couldn't tell my parents because they were encouraging me to do that. And so one day, very deliberately, knowing that the rule was that I shouldn't walk with my tiny little baby sister, I looked around and the woman that was in charge of all of us wasn't there. So I deliberately went and gave my little sister my finger, and she grabbed on, and we were walking. And suddenly I looked up at the house, and there was the woman looking down at me. And I knew I was in trouble. And sure enough, she came out of the door and called me. I had to leave my family playing with them, and I went upstairs, and she took a shoe brush and spanked me with that for breaking that rule. I've never forgotten that because I'm fully aware that I broke the rule, but the rule made no sense to me.
Right.
And so I took matters into my own hands, which I have done many times since then.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense why they would try to separate even the children. I mean, why do you think, looking back now, why do you think they wanted to separate the children from the parents in the first place?
What became very evident in my looking back was they were now a religious community. And when they formed that religious community, the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, when I was an infant, and I don't remember the day at all, they promised, every one of them signed the paper, and I think there may be a copy of it in my book. They signed a paper that said, in forming this religious organization, they promised to obey Father Feeney and whoever he put in charge. And when I would ask my parents long years later, why did you do this? Why did you not push back? Why did you, let them control? They would refer to that vow that they had taken and say we had taken that vow, and as long as they weren't committing a crime, we agreed that we would do it. I found that, I guess, in a way shocking, but it was where their heads were at. They had dedicated their lives, for all intents and purposes, to this doctrine of no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And if that's what it entailed, so be it.
Yeah.
Now, it is true that years later, that we would discuss it, and they, of course, wished things had not turned out the way they had. But I do believe once Father Feeney and Catherine Clarke, and believe me, she was the power behind the throne until she sat on the throne and eviscerated Father Feeney as a person of power in the organization. Her objective was to create a community of people who were dedicated solely to God, which meant that you could have no personal preferences for anyone, including your parents, including your siblings. And so the logic of that separation, the logic of not allowing boys and girls to talk, the logic of not allowing me to hold a girl's hand when I was 9, 10, 11, was all about this not building up any particular friendships. Sister Catherine, as she came to be called, was always talking about how evil it was to have particular friendships.
Oh my gosh. It just sounds like they shut out any form of joy that you could possibly have. And it seems like the grip, was it a slow grip as far as it got worse and worse and worse as time went on? Or did it really feel stark, very different from one point to another? You mentioned your clothes changed, your names were changing, everything was changing, separated from your parents. But then did it just get slowly worse and worse and worse?
Well, there was a pivotal point, and that was when I was 9 years old. We were all living in Cambridge, whole community, 100 people, 39 children, 60 adults. And one day, we all moved, and we moved about 30 miles west of Boston in a town called Harvard, Massachusetts. And we were in a tiny little hamlet within the town called Still River. It was agricultural country, big dairy farms, apple orchards. And Sister Catherine had bought that property, 17 acres, and had built a building. It had an old homestead on it. And that was where we all had our breakfast, lunch, and dinner, where we had mass, where the grown men slept. She built another building, which was where the girls, called Little Sisters, that's the title of the book, had one dormitory. The boys, little brothers, had another dormitory. And then the big sisters had a third wing off to the right. And then we had our school there, our classrooms. And when we moved out there, most of the children were younger than school age. But I was 9 at the time and was in the 4th grade. It was such a change because from that moment on, gone were the evenings with my parents. Suddenly, everything was segregated. And the grown-ups, the husbands and wives, had already been forced to take a vow of celibacy. They were now completely separated, and they couldn't talk to their children at all. And Sister Catherine would allow as how maybe every 3 or 4 months, we could have 45 minutes on a Sunday morning with our own parents.
Ugh.
And what was important about that, I mean, I just couldn't wait for that time to come, but you wanted it to be a happy time. So all the physical abuse, the beatings and things like that were never discussed at those meetings. I just wanted to tell my parents my grades, and I was a very good student, and that I was in the chicken with the chickens. I mean, we became an organic farm. You started to say, did it get darker and darker? The fact of the matter is, when you have the fences built around you and you know what you're allowed to do and not to do, you have to make life for yourself in those circumstances. And there were many, many ways. I mean, I have a lot of happiness in looking back at my childhood. By the time I was 6, I had to accept the fact that I could no longer talk to my parents. That was a case in point, except my father would break the rules. And it worried me when he would break the rules because I was afraid they would kick him out. And then what would I do? But he would always find me on my birthday. We didn't even celebrate birthdays. But he would find me and say, "Happy birthday, my little princess." And I would then find him on his birthday. Now, I've just mentioned to you that all of the parents and children were separated. What I haven't told you is that Sister Catherine herself was married and had 2 children. And she, every Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday, would leave the premises and go and spend the night with her family,
What?
who lived separately.
That's not cool. She just completely disregarded her own rules. Wow. That must have been really aggravating for you to see. And did you know it was going on?
I knew what was going on, but a lot of the smaller children didn't know why she had to leave. And she used to say things like, "Oh, I so wish I didn't have to go." And I would think, really? I was a
Mhm.
thinking child. From the time I was 6 or 7, I knew, well, maybe not 6, 7 or 8, and certainly by the time we moved to Still River, I was well aware inside my own mind and heart that my parents did not want the existence that they were having. I fully blamed Father Feeney and Sister Catherine for the situation that existed.
Yeah. You talk a lot about the militaristic way that you were forced to live as a child. Did that continue or get worse when you moved to the new compound?
When we moved out to the country, absolutely. Silence was the language that we spoke or didn't speak. Silence at breakfast, silence at lunch. Yes, we had recreation and could play in the afternoon. Silence at dinner time until dessert was served. The conversation was always led by the one grown up at the table. So there were 39 children, and they were divided into groups of 4 or 5. There were 20 girls, so there was each a table, and 5 girls sat at a table. And one of the big sisters sat at the head of that table, and she was called an angel. So there were 8 angels. Conversation at the dinner table centered solely around what she wanted to discuss and what questions she would ask at one of us and what we had to give back. There was no sense of animation. There was no questioning. You knew that if you asked a question that had to do with, as I grew older, politics maybe. I was aware, for instance, at the age of 12, that John Kennedy was running for president. And if I asked a question, I was told that was none of my business. I shouldn't know it. I was a hugely curious child, and being shut down did not reduce my curiosity. It only intensified it. But there were very few ways of getting an answer.
And you had no access to any type of worldly thing, right? No music or newspapers.
Well, we did have music, but the music that we learned, and it was classical music, I could read Gregorian chant, and I still can to this day, as though it's regular music. But we did learn music, and we did learn musical instruments. And we did learn all the basics of classical music, because we had a very classical education. But when it came to pop music, popular music, forget it.
Yeah.
We had no television. We had no newspapers. We had no radio. The only time I ever heard the radio was when we were all gathered together, 100 people in the big, huge living room we had in the main house, to listen to John F. Kennedy give his inaugural address. That was the only time I ever heard the radio. We never went out to a restaurant. We never went to a supermarket. We never went to buy clothes. All of our clothes were made for us in the organization by various of the big sisters, my mother being one of those people who made the children's clothes.
Did you ever have any glimpse to the outside world? I think there was a story where you took a trip with Father Feeney to go to the supermarket, not to the supermarket. Was it
Oh, the food market.
the food market? Yeah.
That's when I was very little. I was about 7, maybe. He loved to get out of the compound, and he would take us sometimes on little trips. And the one you talk about, I remember very clearly. He took us to the north end of Boston. That's the Italian section of town. And it had meat markets and it had fruit and vegetable markets. And he liked to take us there. And we all were dressed exactly alike. And he would make us sing, Catholic songs for the people that were the merchants there. And one time we were there, and the Italian manning the stall said, "Here." And he gave Father some peaches and some plums. So Father was turning to us. There were about 6 of us little sisters there. And he said, "What would you like?" And I remember very clearly saying, "I would like a plum." And so I had a plum, and we ate it, and everybody ate. And then 2 days later, we were called in by this woman that was running the children. This was when we were still living in Cambridge. And we were excoriated for having made a decision about what we wanted. The truth was, Father was asking us, would you like this or this? And so she said, if you are asked, what would you like? You are to say, whatever you would like us to have, Father. And we had to say that about 10 times in a row. And never were we ever to say what we wanted. To this day, honestly, it's very funny. If someone says to me, what would you like? The only thing that comes into my head is whatever you would like me to have, Father.
No.
I do express my interest today, but that has been ingrained, embossed in my mind. That's the response.
Yeah, they're trying to strip away every little drop of individuality that you have. It seems like they're trying to cut off your personality. They're trying to cut off your likes. They're trying to cut off friendships, cut off any little bit of joy that you could possibly have. So, can you talk about what your life was like from 9 years up, living in the country, what the day-to-day routine was like, what your expectations were, things like that?
It was a very ordered life. We had to get up, and the angel in charge of us would escort the 5 of us. I was, the oldest at my table. And we would go to Mass, and then we would have breakfast. And then after that, we would go to school, right back at the house where we were. So we would traverse the yard a lot. But remember, this is a big, big, big open space. As I told you, 17 acres. And within a couple of years, we had bought a lot more acreage. And we ultimately had a couple of 100 acres.
Wow.
And everybody was assigned a role when we moved up to Still River. I was very aware of the roles that my parents played and everyone else. I was, as I said, a very curious child. And so I became aware. What I wasn't fully understanding of at all until I was much older was that all the truly intellectual people at the center, like my father, like the 3 men who were professors at Boston University, they were given tasks that were utterly non-intellectual. My father was now responsible for fixing the cars, the automobiles. We had 6 or 7 or 8 automobiles, which in a group of 100 you could understand. For me, not thinking, oh, does he want to do something intellectual rather than physical? I loved it because the cars were always repaired right between the 2 houses. I had to walk past him half a dozen times a day. And most of the time he was under the hood of a car doing something. And he would look up and was very aware when I or my siblings or even other little sisters were coming over. And all he would do, because he wasn't allowed to talk to me, was he would just wave his little pinky like that at me. And for me, that was as good as gold.
Hmm.
It made me immensely happy.
Oh, that's so
Sister
sweet.
Catherine's office sat right above where the cars were repaired. So I was fully aware that Sister Catherine could look down and be aware that my father was fixing the car as I was coming by. But remember how I said on Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, she left. And on those days, he was much bolder. He would whisper, "How's my little princess?"
Hmm.
There was something that happened in the entire organization. When Sister Catherine left on those 3 afternoons and didn't come back till midday the following day, I noticed the environment was much calmer. Even the angels, who were the disciplinarians of the 39 children, they were more relaxed. They would laugh. We could get away with stuff that we couldn't get away with when Sister Catherine was right at home at the place. That I didn't start to notice till I was more of 11 or 12 or 13 years old. But it was an important recognition that I came to, that even the adults were in fear of Sister Catherine.
It's interesting that it's a woman who's basically over this whole camp because normally it's a very patriarchal figure like Father Feeney. So, how did she kind of take over and become the head of this?
Well, as I mentioned to you, Father Feeney was a romantic, and he really was. And I say that not in a sexual way at all, but he always wanted happiness to flow out of situations. Sister Catherine was a dictator. She was rule bound. She had in her own head, I am quite sure, what she ultimately wanted. As I've written in my first book, every single day, Sister Catherine would come into our refectories. So the little sisters sat in one refectory, the little brothers in another. There was a door between them. She would stand in between them and, talk to us. At least 3 times a week, she would say, "You are the luckiest 39 children in the world, because from the day you were born, you were dedicated to God." I didn't really appreciate that or very much understand it until I got a bit older and suddenly realized that the implication in that was that I would end up staying in the community all my life and becoming a nun. Now, a nun was the last thing in the world I wanted to be. In fact, I had this daily daydream, and it was me sitting in a walled garden with beautiful rose bushes around, reading a book. And all of a sudden, over the wall would come my prince, who would take me by the hand, and we would fly off up into the sky and go to his castle, where we would live happily ever after, and I would have lots of children. Not that I had a clue how that happened. But that was my daily, daily, daily dream. And I think it was to tell myself there was something else. And yet, as I got older, it was quite evident that Sister Catherine was hell-bent that none of us would leave. Now, occasionally they kicked someone out, one of the grown-ups, no children at that point. And once someone was kicked out, they were never spoken of again. It was as though they had died.
Mm.
The only safe place to be in one's mind was within the community. And therefore, I had no option but to become a nun. And it was the last thing I wanted to do. And I remember the day when I took that first vow as a postulant. We had a big celebratory meeting afterwards. And I write this in my book, and to this day, I do not quite understand how this all happened. But at this family reunion, as it were, with my parents, at the very end of the meeting, when I was sick to my stomach, because now I would no longer even be able to talk to my own little sisters.
Oh my gosh. How old were you?
I was 14. And my mother quietly pulled me aside at that meeting, and she said to me, "If this is not what you really want, you let me know." Well, one, I was stunned at her comment. 2, I thought, how does she know I don't want this? And 3, I thought, well, what can she do for me? I'm not even allowed to talk to her. How can I tell her? And 4, I suppose I should say, it would have been anathema. It would have been evil for me, as it were, to be an apostate, to not embrace being a nun. That being said, by the age of 14, I was already having crushes. And the boys in the organization were much younger than I was for the most part. I mean, there were a couple my age. So I ended up having a couple of different crushes on the men in the organization. But I knew so little about life. I didn't even know what a crush was. I didn't know why it happened. I didn't know what to do about it. All I knew was that I was in trouble. And Sister Catherine was furious with me because she would tell me I was following someone. You better believe I was following someone. It was a totally silent engagement. I wasn't allowed to speak to anyone, never touched, never held hands, never, much less kissed. I mean, didn't do anything. I was just fascinated. And ultimately, Sister Catherine kicked me out for that very reason.
Wow. Just for the desire to want to be with someone or to be fascinated with someone. As you said, you didn't even really know what that meant or what sex was. Or I'm wondering, as a 14-year-old, when you're doing that vow or taking that vow, did you understand what it meant to be a nun or what you were giving yourself to?
All I knew was it meant that I would not get married.
Okay.
What was entailed in marriage? I mean, Sister Catherine was so adamant that we not really understand the roles of love and romance. We never studied biology. I did very well in chemistry, and we were very well schooled, but biology was not a course that was given. And I know it was Sister Catherine who said that, and I'm sure that Sister Anne Mary, who was the principal and a wonderful, wonderful human being, I'm sure she said, okay, they have to take some science, so if it's not going to be biology, it will be chemistry. And it was fine, and we had a great teacher who had majored in chemistry in college. But she was in such control of every element of our life that she wanted to prevent the knowledge of what the real world was about.
Mm-hmm. I'm really curious about being in this group where they're clearly saying to you, you're lucky because we are the true Catholics and only we are going to make it to heaven, or only we are doing it the right way. Everyone else is wrong. Yet you're going against the traditional Catholic sentiment of multiply and have as many kids as God will bless you with by the celibacy thing and by making the children nuns. And so I'm so interested if you know why she was going in a complete opposite direction when you clearly can't bring people into this one true way, and it seems like it would just die with all of you.
I spoke to my mother about that one time, and this is very interesting because there's no answer truly available. But my mother told me that while she was still Sister Elizabeth Ann at the center, Sister Catherine told her one day. Why Sister Catherine confided in her this way, I have no idea. But Sister Catherine told her that her wedding night was the worst night of her life. She had gotten married around the age of 28, 29, 30 or so. And I knew her husband. He was around, but not part of the organization. He was a tall, really lovely man. I have no idea why she said that. But my mother told me, when she finally told me that story, my mother must have been in her 60s when she told me that story, and she said, I think Sister Catherine just hated sex.
Wow.
If you look at the things that were done at the center, you could have that. My mother was very, very perceptive. And it is possible that she abhorred sex, and therefore anything that was anti-sex was good in her mind. Now, it was not because Hank, her husband, was a bad man. I have sometimes wondered, and I have no way of knowing to this day, whether maybe she was sexually abused when she was a child.
Mm.
And were there certain memories that came back? And if that is the case, she then chose to direct the entire momentum of her life to make sure that nobody ever had sex.
Wow. That's so interesting because she has this entire life outside of the group. Her husband wasn't even a part of it. And she's like, sorry, babe, I'm just going to go and run this commune. Be back in a few days. That's so wild to me.
And they did not live as husband and wife. They did not share the same bed. He agreed. He let her have her way in their first week of marriage. And they had 2 children. They were both adopted. And when
Oh,
Sister Catherine died, 2 years after she kicked me out, her son learned that he was adopted by reading her obituary.
wow. That's a lot. I mean, we could speculate all day as to
So
why
far.
she imposed these rules. I mean, because even part of me wonders if maybe she was attracted to women, and that's why she was so interested in the nun lifestyle of just complete celibacy without men at all. But she was married. But I don't know. There's so many different things and avenues that we could speculate on. But let's get back to your story specifically. So, as a teenager, you're having normal teenage thoughts, you're having crushes, even if you don't necessarily know what that entails or what that means. And then you get called into the office. Can you tell us that story of when you are actually told that you will be kicked out into the big, scary world that you have been taught is evil and atrocious your whole life?
I remember being told that Sister Catherine wanted to see me. That was not unusual. I was in trouble for something, it seemed, on a weekly basis. And I was thinking, what this time? What this time? So I go over to the main house, knock on the library. Her office was right off the library. Knock on the door, and she says, "Come in." And I open the door, and she's sitting there at the desk. Father Feeney is not in his big red chair that he used to recline in. And standing in the room is my mother, whom I only think of as Sister Elizabeth Ann. Never in my life had I been in that office with Sister Catherine, which I'd done many times, and my mother in the same room. And Sister Catherine had this absolutely dulcet tone voice. And she started, I'm thinking, what is wrong? I'm thinking, has Brother James Aloysius, which was how I referred to my father, has something gone wrong? Has he sick? Has he died? Why are the two of them having this conversation with me before it had even started? And Sister Catherine said in such a sweet voice, "You know, darling, not everyone is given a vocation to become a nun." And I'm thinking, well, I certainly know that's true. I'm
Yeah.
thinking, where is this taking me? And she goes on and she starts talking about that there is another way, and some people do go out and live a life out in the world. And I'm thinking, but that's what she told us we couldn't do. And then the conversation turns, and my mother is completely silent, just standing there, listening. And I glance over at her occasionally. And then Sister Catherine goes on to say, but you have to understand, dear, that out in the world, which was the way we referred to everything that wasn't our home community. And she then goes on to say, you will hear two words. And I'm thinking, I don't even know what she's talking about. And then she then says, rape and diet. I don't even know how to respond. And in my head, I've never even heard the word rape. I have no idea what it means. And the word diet, the only way I knew the word diet was because in the Catholic history, they had these diets, and which were big meetings of bishops all over Europe. And there was something called the Diet of Worms, which was a city in Germany. And I'm thinking, what does diet have to do with what she's telling me about, that out there in the world? It was a long, long time before I ever found out what those two words were. But she picks those two words out of the whole lexicon of the world to tell me
Yeah.
I will hear those two words. She doesn't explain what either of them is. So suddenly I go, oh my God, she is kicking me out. I thought I was going to be gone that night because when people were kicked out, they were gone. And I said, I was relieved that at least my father wasn't dead, but I was thinking, well, how am I going to finish high school? I was a senior. And I said, can I stay till I finish high school? This was in October that she told me that, and we were going to graduate in June. She said, oh, yes, dear, you can stay until you graduate. So then I thought, well, are they going to tell people? So I asked, can I say anything? She said, no, darling, we don't want you to say anything to anyone because we don't want the community to be upset. So what she really wanted was to make sure that no one knew, and then I would just be whisked off, which I was 2 hours after I graduated. My siblings didn't even know. Well, my sister Catherine did because she was also a postulant with me, and she started to just see me crying every single night. And she said, what's wrong? I said, I can't tell you.
Yeah.
And so she finally went to Sister Catherine and said, why does she cry every single night? And so Sister Catherine shared with her that I would be gone. But my younger brother and my two baby sisters didn't know a thing. My parents were informed, quite obviously, and my mother never said a word at that meeting.
Oh my gosh. This must have been a very conflicting time for you. You're 17, almost 18. You clearly have curiosity about the world. You don't want to be a nun, but also you've been told your entire life that the outside world is evil. And now she's telling you these two random, why she picked those words, diet and rape. It actually makes me wonder if your speculation was correct and maybe something did happen to her, and that's her idea of the outside world that she's trying to shield everybody from. But what's going through your mind? Obviously, you're upset that you have to leave. Was any part of you excited to experience the outside world?
I think so, but I think it was sublimated under the fear of that world, which I knew nothing about,
Yeah.
and the fact that I knew no one, no one. The only people I knew, my uncles and aunts and cousins, they were not part of my life because everyone in the community had to renounce any family members. There were people, they're adults, whose parents died, weren't even allowed to go to their parents' funeral. We're not allowed
Mm,
to see them before they died. And for me, I think it was just, which was worse, to be kicked out or to be a nun? And the decision was made for me. And it wasn't long after I got out that I was pleased to be learning around about the real world. But when I wrote my first book, I gave it to the woman that now runs what the men and the women all split up. And it was very acrimonious after Sister Catherine died. But there was a woman there, and she had been one of the angels. She's still alive. She's one of the very, very few people that were a generation older than I am that is still alive. And when I gave her the book, I said, I don't think you're going to like this book, but I think it's only honorable of me to share it with you because it is going to be published. And she said to me at that time, well, you always wanted to leave. And I said back to her, not under the conditions that I left in,
yeah.
where there was no advice about the outside world, no invitation to come back, no education that I needed before going out. She felt that kicking me out was justified because I was curious about the outside world. Kicking me out was not justified. Allowing me to leave in an honorable way would have been the right way to do it. But if that happened,
Right.
who's to say all the other children wouldn't suddenly want to go? I have no idea.
Yeah.
But that's not the way the organization thought. And some of these things that I've thought much more about after writing the book are what's really allowed me to understand the cult-like behavior of the organization. And recently, I started to watch the first episode of Handmaid's Tale. My children had watched it all. They were fascinated by it. And I kept thinking, why doesn't sound like the kind of thing I would find interesting? And I have been very, very lucky in my life. And there are not too many things that have brought back really bad memories that shake me regarding my childhood. I've been able to say these were the cards I was dealt and go on and make a wonderful life. But I decided to watch Handmaid's Tale. I was not 20 minutes into the first episode when I got so upset internally and I had to turn it off.
Ugh,
The
yeah.
recreation was how life seemed to me at the center. Everybody was spying on everybody else. And nobody was allowed to talk to anybody. That's a control mechanism. So when you would see people talking, you would wonder, was it about you? And I have never been able to watch any more of Handmaid's Tale. It truly triggered me. And I have not truly understood for most of my life what triggering really means, what happens to you when you're triggered. But in this case, I fully understand it and appreciate it, and I cannot watch that show.
Wow, it's interesting because so many interviews that we've conducted, people have had the exact same response as you from completely different backgrounds. I think it really put into perspective and it really illustrated high control groups to its finest degree, to where so many people can relate and feel like that was my life. And it's terrifying to think that that's actually the case in today's world, that something so controlling and so what seems to be archaic could actually be happening in today's world. And the thing that I can't get out of my mind is how you, as an 18-year-old who had never been exposed to the outside world, manage to go about your life. How did you find shelter? How did you figure out how to get a job? How did you figure out how to go shopping for yourself? There's so many things that would have been completely brand new.
That is true. And that summer when I was kicked out, for the first few weeks I stayed with my uncle and aunt and my cousins, one of whom was exactly my age and was heading off to college in the fall. And then later in the summer, my mother drove with me down to Maryland, where her side of the family came from.
Mm.
And the whole time I'm thinking, my cousin Paul is going off to college, and what am I going to do? What am I supposed to do? I was not allowed. I was not invited back to the center. And when my mother and I were driving north from Maryland, she told me that Sister Catherine had allowed as how I could stay in a house on the property, not the two big houses where everybody met and had mass and had their food and schooling, but another house that was separated while she sent me to secretarial school. Now, I had already been accepted at Vassar and Bates College, and she had made me apply because she wanted our school to be accredited. And I got
Oh.
into both colleges, but she forced me to write a letter saying I was not coming. But she got the last, I was her ammunition in getting the school accredited. And once that was done, she didn't need me anymore. And so she was sending me to a secretarial school. I had been educated with 6 years of Latin, a year of classical Greek. We had classes in etymology. I was a great math student. And I was aching to be able to do more of that. And she decided I would go to a secretarial school. And while I was there, I could commute back and forth as long as I stayed in this house and did not see anyone, did not talk to my siblings, did not talk to anyone. And it was during that period that I actually enjoyed the time with my parents. But the moment I completed the course, I did get a job, and I was very lucky because I wasn't exactly sure how to even look for a job. And I was offered a job by the headmistress of the school. And she was offering me a job to teach typing. How could I say no? I needed a job. I needed to be off the center's property when I graduated. And I found a room at the YWCA in a very unfashionable section of Boston. And that's where I lived. And I was making $85 a week. And then one day she asked me if I would teach 3 evenings a week, and she would give me an incremental $15. I had no sooner said yes when I regretted it because I realized if I was ever going to get my degree, I would have to do it at night.
Yeah.
And that I was able to do when I moved on from the secretarial school and got my first job as a receptionist.
Wow. So then how did you end up on Wall Street?
It was through that first job. I was the receptionist at a brokerage firm.
Oh.
I loved everything about it. I mean, I didn't even know what a receptionist really did. I learned pretty quickly. And of course, you had to answer the phones, and there were a lot of very rude customers. And I tell a lot of funny stories about them. Now, this is in my second book, Breaking Glass. It was fascinating business to me. And so all these brokers had different demands and needs. And I would get everybody their lunches every day from the deli across the street. But then I knew one person was interested in such and such a stock. And there was a tape that, kind of ribboned, and it just it gave every single piece of updated information on every stock. And so I would go through those and find the things that different brokers needed and wanted, and started making myself appreciated and valuable. And it was great fun. But I had some very boring parts of my job. I had to, take old pages out of a book and put new pages in. And I decided they were all about all the stocks that were listed on the stock exchange. And so I decided, as part of that job, I would memorize the stock symbol for every stock on the New York Stock Exchange.
Wow.
And I did that. And then I would go into the trading room and I would test myself to make sure that I was doing it. I had it all, and I did. And I was 20 years old when the head partner at the office there came out to me and said, "I'm wondering if you would be willing to do us a favor tomorrow." I was right away said, "Yes." And he said, "I need you to fly to New York. Here's a ticket on the Eastern Shuttle." And he said, "I need you to go to 5 different places in New York and collect $1 million from each person, because we need that $5 million to close the deal tomorrow night."
Whoa.
I didn't even know what a deal was. So I flew down to New York. The limousine picked me up at LaGuardia Airport. I went to all 5 places. I came back to Boston, went into the office by about 6 or 7 o'clock, presented the $5 million. I mean, I never had $10,000 in my hands, much less $5 million. And then the 2 partners took me out to dinner that night at the Ritz-Carlton. And I saw another world that had not been introduced to me before. And it was the blue velvet seats and the chandeliers and the waiters with the white gloves and the stemware and the silver and the china. And that night, and they were thanking me for having done a great job, a flawless job. And that night in bed, I remember thinking to myself, I wonder if someday I can have a job like theirs.
Wow. Talk about a complete 180 from where you came from, what you were used to, and now your eyes are open to this immaculate world. And especially for a curious mind, that must have just been food for the soul.
It was. It was. And, I did not know what I would ever do for a career. And so I love mentoring now. And I really tell people you don't have to know what you want. Some people know at age 5 they want to be a brain surgeon. Good for them. And they end up being a brain surgeon. But I think my way just wended itself slowly, and opportunities came. I was laid off many times because, catastrophes would happen in the market. But it was rewarding. It was very, very rewarding.
Yeah.
I am very grateful. And I think there are a lot of disciplines that I learned in my childhood that ended up being very valuable to me. And I will tell you one story, because Sister Catherine was not a mentor to me. And my second book is dedicated to the mentors I had in my life. And they're all men, because there were no women on Wall Street when I came in. Oh,
Yeah.
there were, but they weren't in positions for the most part to be able to be of great help. But I thought back to my childhood, and there was one person at the center who really, in a time of stress, became a mentor to me. And that was the principal of our school, Sister Anne Mary. She had gone to Radcliffe. She was highly educated. Her father was the principal of a high school in the middle of the state. And she knew I was leaving. Sister Catherine had obviously told her. And in the afternoons, she would sometimes call me into one of what we called our tutoring rooms. They were small classrooms. And she would just sit and chat with me. And I remember one day in particular when she said to me, "You are going to do very well in life." She said, "You are hardworking, you have common sense, and you love solving problems." And then she said something that Sister Catherine would have said was totally inappropriate. She said to me, "You have the best of Brother James Aloysius and Sister Elizabeth Ann in you. Nobody ever referred to the parents of the children, but she was telling me that I was like my parents.
Mm.
And she gave me confidence. Sister Catherine, I am sure, would have been happy if a truck had run over me when I left. But Sister Anne Mary was the one that built me up the confidence, even though I didn't know the language of the world outside. I had never heard a swear word. I had never heard a slang word. I didn't know a single baseball player. I didn't know, I mean, I'd heard one snippet of a Beatles song that Father Feeney said was music of the devil. I knew nothing. So when I went to that secretarial school, I was eyes open, ears open, and mouth closed.
Oh, yeah. What do you have any memories that stick out to you as far as moments when you realized something about the world or everyone realized you didn't know anything about the world? Anything like that?
There is one. It's in my second book. So when I was at the secretarial school, in those first few months, two incidents really come to mind. So remember, I took the bus back and forth from Still River to Boston every day. And one day, a man sitting next to me on the bus turned to me and in a very soft voice said, "Has anyone ever told you you look like Lauren Bacall?" Well, I thought, who is this man talking to me? He wasn't introduced properly. And I'm thinking to myself, but who is Lauren Bacall? And I'm thinking and going, Lauren Bacall, remember that name. You'll have to find out who Lauren Bacall is. So that evening at dinner with my mother, I thought, I'm just going to ask her. So I said, Sister Elizabeth Ann, who is Lauren Bacall? And she got this big smile on her face and she said, oh, darling, she's a beautiful actress. And of course, she had done lots of movies in the 40s when my mother was definitely out there and going to movies. And I just remember thinking, beautiful and actress, those two words were never put together at the center. Actress meant going to hell. And I thought to myself, is Sister Elizabeth Ann trying to educate me, or did she slip? At any rate, I felt there was an opportunity to learn. And I'm going to tell you something funny. 10 years, no, I was 18 at the time, maybe 12 years later, I was at a dinner party out on Long Island, and it was a fundraiser for the local fire department. I remember it so well, but it was fancy. It was black tie, it was fun, it was beautiful. And we were sitting at these big picnic tables. And a man across the table from me suddenly turned to me and said, has anyone ever told you you look like Lauren Bacall? And now I'm 76 years old. It has happened 2 more times in the last 5 years. So for me, I feel I don't know how it's managing all the way up to age 76, but that was one. And I'll tell you one other little incident that is very funny. There was one word. I would sometimes look up words in the dictionary, but we didn't have any urban dictionary back then. So
Yeah.
we didn't really, it was hit or miss. But there was one word that was used so often by everyone. And I said, I've got to find out what this word means. And I was thinking, whom shall I ask? And so the girls at the secretarial school could be put into various categories. There were kind of the rough ones who hadn't had a very proper education and they probably weren't capable of going to college. And, they were looking to get a job. Then there were some who were very well-mannered, but all they did was talk about boys. So you could tell that they were just looking to find the right man, and their career would be to be a wife and a mother. And then there was a third set of girls that I felt were I could be the most comfortable with. I could tell that they were Catholic. I could tell that they had gone to parochial school. They had impeccably good grammar. They had nice manners. And I thought the only thing I had to make sure was they didn't find out where I came from, because we were scorned as the Feeniites. But there was one girl I thought, okay, I'm going to ask her what this word means because everybody's using it. And I was very nervous for days on end. And I thought, oh God, how am I going to do this? And finally, it was a Friday afternoon. And I walked up to her And I said, could you help me with something? She said, yes. Because we never talked long because, of course, I never wanted to give away any of the evidence that I really knew nothing about the world. And I just blurted it out. I said, can you tell me what the word shit means? And she looked at me and she said, shit. I froze. I did not know what to do, except I wasn't going to stand there looking like an idiot. So I just said, thank you. Have a nice weekend. See you on Monday. And I walked down the upstairs, out onto the street, going to the bus stop, and said, that's it. I'm never, never, never asking another question in my whole life.
Oh, no. So when did you find out?
I don't know, but it was slow and painful, honestly.
So one question that I keep thinking about is these people who are in this group, this community, it seemed like a lot of them were very intelligent, scholared people.
Yes,
So,
Dave.
and I'm not going to ask the stupid question of how could they fall for it? But what I'm wondering is, because I know it's like boiling a frog, right? It just all of a sudden becomes something and you don't know how to get out. But did anybody actually try to leave? Once Sister Catherine had passed away, did anyone just say, you know what, I'm out of here?
Very much so. But I will tell you, one person left before Sister Catherine died, well before she died. And he was one of the dads. And he had 5 boys. And he went to his wife and said, I want to leave with my family. I will go get my law degree. I will make a living for us. And she said no. So he was kicked out. 2 years later, he came back with a lawsuit. This was when in 1960 he left. The lawsuit took several years to come to fruition, and he was granted custody of all 5 boys. And in the course of that, a lot of things came out, and then a lot of things didn't come out. There was complete manipulation of the children and what they were allowed to say in court. But that was one of the reasons Sister Catherine needed me to apply to Vassar and Bates. Bates was where my father had gone. Part of the case had been that we were not being well educated. And so she said, okay, I'm going to have her apply. And if she gets into Vassar, it can hardly say that she wasn't well educated. And
Yeah.
so by getting into Vassar, I basically saved the community. But once Sister Catherine died, another example of why I should have figured out at some point that this was a cult, the whole place started to fall apart. There was no glue. There was no successor. The grown men and the grown women started fighting. All the children started going to their parents and telling them about the abusive behavior that had taken place. And that was the beginning of a complete reassessment of the whole organization. And then sometime in the early 70s, the organization, the men split up completely from the women, and they were re-accepted by the Catholic Church and became a Benedictine monastery.
Mm.
And the sisters went through their own form, and they remained just a pious order of nuns. But in the process, families were split up. There were some women who would not leave when their husbands said they wanted to leave. There were some children who stayed for a while, but so Sister Catherine died in 68. My father left, and my mother, but my mother had really come out a little bit earlier. But my father, mother, and 2 of my 4 siblings left in 1969. And the other 2 siblings, who had already become fully professed nuns, left in 1971. And so from that point on, our family was completely reunited. And we never did have any fights. There was no animosity. I think there will perpetually be, curiosity and lack of understanding, since I don't think I could have ever done that. But I think it was most particularly because my father broke the rules, finding me on my birthday to wish me happy birthday, my little princess, wiggling his little finger. Those things, which for me, what told me that my parents loved me. There were children whose parents did not break the rules. And their children said, "You abandoned me. There was no way to connect with you."
Yeah.
And these, despite the fact that these were highly educated and intelligent people, there was an emotional part that they did not know how to overcome.
Wow. So you do have a relationship with your family today?
Wonderful one, a wonderful one. And my mother read every chapter of Little Sister. And she said, "It's all true. Parts of it make me sad, but you need to publish it." I was sitting with my parents when I was 55, and I told them on my birthday, I was thinking of writing the stories of my childhood. I said, because I actually look back with a lot of pleasure on my childhood. Both of them were so supportive. But for 5 years, couldn't figure out how to get it down on paper. I didn't know whether I should write it with a pseudonym or write it in the third person. And a friend of mine said, "Go to this place that is a writer's workshop." And I went to the memoir writing class there. And for several years, once a week, I would go there and I learned the craft of writing. By the time I turned 60, my father was 90 and he had passed away. But my mother was considerably younger than my father. And she read every single bit that I wrote. And so I knew it had the blessing of my parents. And I'm sure you've seen the dedication in that book is to Mother and Daddy for always letting me know that they loved me.
That's so sweet. Wow, I'm so happy to hear that you're able to have that relationship. Not everyone is fortunate enough to reconnect with family after leaving high control groups, and that's wonderful to hear. And you were clearly successful with your businesses and everything that you did afterwards. So now I just want to know how you're doing now, what brings you happiness and peace?
Well, I've been very, very fortunate. And a career on Wall Street was a wonderful one. I had my children, as I mentioned, at 45. I was a late bloomer. They are now 30 years old. My daughter got married this past summer. I feel immensely blessed. But I also know that there are deep, dark stories that still exist. And I do a couple of things to kind of make myself whole. I do a lot of mentoring. I've become very open-minded and I really, really try to help other people. And my success has been very fortunate, but I see how other people suffer and have great difficulty. I was able to take the past and kind of not rue it, but take all my energies and go forward and look to the future. But I know not everyone can do that. So I spend a lot of time mentoring. And the other thing that I did about 8 years ago, I co-founded a healthcare company for the LGBTQ community. And that's my full-time job. And I'm pro bono CEO, but for me, it's a mission and it's giving back. And it might not be what Sister Catherine would have ever wanted me to do, but
Probably
I
not.
see my vocation now.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm so happy for you. And we'll make sure that all the links are in the description so people can check out both of your books about your childhood and then about your time on Wall Street. That's so exciting. And I guess we just need your Linda Listen moment, which is the sassy statement as the viral video with the toddler goes, or something inspirational for our viewers. It's up to you.
Well, I think that I like to say to people, take what you have and make the most of it. There is always something good out there in the future. And try not to think, woe is me, because if you look forward with optimism, things will come your way.
All right, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing, Patricia. It's been wonderful talking with you. You're such a great storyteller. Do you have any other final thoughts before we go?
Well, I have a third book I'm going to write,
Uh-huh.
and I know the title and the subtitle, but I have to be working on my second book right now for sales. So, but the third book is going to be called, it's going to be a series of essays and stories, in-scene stories, and it's going to be called Conversions. And the subtitle is going to be aching to disbelieve. We
Mm.
all enter the world, and I entered the world, the real world, with a lot of stuff packed into my head that I have had to unbelieve.
Yeah.
And the stories of how you see the light and you realize, that was not right, what I believed so far, is for me very important. And it's made me a much more open, supportive, engaged human being. And some of them are very funny stories. I don't even know what all of them are yet. But the more I think about what happened in my childhood, the more I think that there is a great opportunity. And I will tell you, sometimes Sister Catherine, let's just give her an example, she was never a mentor to me, but in an interesting way, she was a role model. And I think that role model for a woman on Wall Street was an exemplary one because her attitude was defeat never. And she made sure that the only thing she couldn't control about being defeated was death. And it came early to her. She was only 67. But the truth was, she ruled with an iron hand, but she also, nobody ever said no to her. Not one man, not one woman, not Father Feeney.
Wow.
And so I think there was something with going into Wall Street where my role model subliminally in my head was someone who was undefeated.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's cool that you can take that perspective because, of course, there were a lot of more negative, toxic things that happened at her hand, but being able to see what you can take from that and make yourself into an unstoppable woman. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you again for coming on. I appreciate you sharing.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this time.
Great. So, guys, make sure you leave those words of encouragement down below for Patricia. If you want to get in contact with her, her Instagram, Patricia Walsh Chadwick, we'll put the links in the description. Her website, patriciachadwick.com, and make sure to check out both of her books. If you want to support the channel, the best way is just watching our videos to the end, liking, sharing, commenting, even if it's an emoji, that means a lot to us. And if you want to support further, you can become a patron at patreon.com/cults2consciousness. We have some merch at cults2consciousness.com under the merch tab. If you want to go to Mexico with us, there are less than 30 days to book. So early Christmas present to yourself if you want to go and do some beachy things, swim in waterfalls, snorkeling, the whole thing. It's going to be great. We also have a sister channel, Cults to Consciousness Clips. If you want to watch 8 to 10 minute clips of our videos instead of the long form ones every now and then, you can do that. And if you like this video, I'll link 2 more down here below. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious and be well.